So now we're going to turn our attention to a more general production subsidy. But again, we're sticking with the scenario where the home country is an exporter in this market. So what's the difference between a broader production subsidy and the export subsidy? Well, now the domestic producers will get the subsidy regardless of whether they export the product or sell it domestically. And that's important because if you think about how the government might implement this particular intervention, they don't have to put in an import tariff to push the domestic price up because the producers are going to get that subsidy regardless of where they sell. So again, we're going to start with a small country case, okay? So we're illustrating the small country case. And then I'll also talk a little bit, without drawing all of the diagrams for them, we'll talk about also what you would see then in the large country case, because really the comparison between the production and the export subsidies are very similar in terms of how they differ between staying within small country or large country assumption. So again, small country means horizontal import demand curve. Initial exports are X0. Here's our quantity supplied and demanded, right? And that X0 is of course equal to QS0 minus QD0. So now, what happens when we put the subsidy in place? And I'm actually going to start just by focusing on what's happening here in this graph. So in this case, we're just shifting our supply curve down by the amount of the subsidy. Okay. And so let's say that this is our supply curve plus the subsidy. Well, the world price is still here at PW. So what's going to happen is that we'd see that the domestic firms are going to be willing to sell at that world price out here. Right? The other way you could see it is if you go up to the original supply curve, right? Remember, the distance, the vertical distance between the original supply curve and the moment of the subsidy is the amount of the subsidy. Okay? So when we're looking at this, you can see that quantity supplied would increase. But what's the big difference, right, that we see between the production subsidy and the export subsidy is that because the domestic price stays at the world price of PW, we're not putting a tariff in place to push the domestic price up to match what the domestic producers are getting when they export, there's no consumption loss or consumption distortion. And all of the loss is going to come because of the fact that we're increasing our production. And remember that the distortions come from the fact that we're changing the quantities supplied and the quantity demanded. Right? We're not getting the optimal quantities produced and consumed. That's what's creating deadweight loss. That's what's creating the distortions. So this one's actually a little bit easier now to track. Okay? So we're going to label now just 3 different areas, A, B, and C. So A is the area to the left of the demand curve and between PW and PW plus the subsidy. B is the area between the supply and demand curves, the original ones, the original supply curve, and these 2 prices. In C, that's the area between the world price and the world price plus the subsidy and our initial and new quantities supplied, so QS0 and QS1. So what is the change in consumer surplus? It's nothing. Right? We're not actually affecting them in any way here. They're not seeing any higher price. They're not changing their consumption. There's no impact in this case on the domestic consumer. And what about our change in producer surplus? Well, again, here, what are we looking for? We're looking for an increase, right? You got a higher price, and they're going to produce a bit more. So for the producers, they're gaining A and B. And what about the cost of implementing this program for the government? Well, so we want to be careful here. Before, they were only right? The government was only paying the subsidy on the units of the good that were being exported. Right? So that would have been from QS1 out to, say, QD0. But now it's a general production subsidy. They're paying that subsidy on every unit of the good that's being produced and sold. So the total subsidy cost is, right, this is the per unit subsidy, is this vertical height here, times every unit of the good that's being sold. Right, so the total government cost of running the program is A plus B and C. So while the producers are gaining A and B, that's really just coming at the expense of the taxpayers. And so now we're left with what we're labeling C, right? That's just our production loss. So in terms of a direct comparison, if you had an equivalent sized subsidy, right, same, talking about comparing production subsidy to an export subsidy, for the same sized subsidy, the export subsidy is worse. It's creating more distortion by affecting both domestic consumption and production. Right? So in terms of welfare loss, the general production subsidy is actually a better bet. Now, of course, we have to ask, what is the goal of this policy? Are you trying to shore up domestic producers? Well, if that's the case, then the direct production subsidy is actually the better way to go. This raises for us this concept, this term that we call specificity. What specificity says is that whatever your policy goal is, you should try to get as directly to that goal as you want, okay, to achieve. We're going to see this come up again later when we talk about issues of kind of environmental and labor issues that get wrapped up with trade sometimes. But whatever your goal is, you want to get the policy tool that most directly addresses that question. So if it's an issue of supporting domestic producers, well, why would you make a distinction between whether they're exporting or just producing more generally? Now, as I said, I'm not going to draw all the graphs again for the large country case. But again, you want to go back and think, what happened with the large country case? With the large country case, right, we saw this big shift out of the supply curve, and that ended up putting downward pressure on the world price, and it created this overall distortion, right? So you think about the large country case. Right, you had a total welfare loss that was, if you remember, B, D, and E. And what was driving E was the size of that terms of trade loss, right? The fact that we were putting downward pressure on the world price. And of course, you also had this, right, this consumption distortion. Well, again, if it's a general export subsidy or production subsidy rather than that targeted export subsidy, you won't get that consumption loss. You'll also get a smaller terms of trade loss, right? Because and it's easy to see that even just by looking at this graph. What happens to the total change in exports? In this case, exports are only going up due to the increase in production. Right? There is no attendant decrease in consumption. So the shift out of the export supply curve in this case is actually much smaller than it is with the overall export subsidy instead of the general production subsidy. You'll get a similar scenario with the large country case. Right? The shift out in the export supply curve is smaller with the general production subsidy than it is for the export subsidy, which means you'll have a smaller decrease in the world price and a smaller terms of trade loss E. Okay? So it doesn't matter if we're talking about a small country or a large country scenario. In either case, the production subsidy is not as distortionary and does not create as large of a welfare loss as the export subsidy. Next, we're going to turn our attention to looking at export tariffs.